Hello, and welcome to our webinar on creating the Green Corridor. Thank you very much for dialing in. It's exactly 1 year to go until the world will be in Glasgow for the COP26 UN Climate Change Summit. So this is the second in a series of webinars we're running this week to mark that. On Monday, we heard about how HS2 stations will be some of the most environmentally friendly in the world. And tomorrow we're hosting a webinar on how HS2 will help to decarbonise transport more broadly. And this morning, we're here to talk about how we will create a new green corridor running alongside the railway. So we open all live events with some technical advice should you experience any connection issues. All lines are muted, so you don't have to worry about any background noise. If your feed freezes, wait for a few seconds as it will most likely correct itself. If this doesn't happen, use the leave button to exit the call and rejoin using the event link. You'll be able to use the toggle at the bottom of your screen to rewind back to where you left. You can also pause at any point during the call should you need to. If you disconnect and you're unable to rejoin due to a wider Microsoft incident, we will email you with the next steps. There's a Q&A and comment function, which you should be able to find in the top right hand of your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the event and we'll ask them to speakers at the end. So that's all from me. I'm now going to hand over to our first speaker from HS2 Limited, David Green.
Thank you, Hugo. Thank you everyone for joining. So I'm going to set the scene around the policy and principles that we have for the Green Corridor with HS2. So as part of the presentation, what I'm going to talk about is the background, what we're producing in terms of a Green Corridor prospectus, outline also a mapping tool that we're producing, and outline some exemplar projects. So in terms of the Green Corridor, about 2 years ago, we produced a document called More Than a Railway, which outlined very broad brush terms our aspiration for creating a green corridor alongside the railway. And within that, there was the statistics around what we'll be producing in terms of mitigation, but we're also hinted on that we were trying to do more for green corridor and the environment. So what is the Green Corridor? Well, I think the easiest thing to do is by way of a drawing to try and explain that. So if we have a landscape, obviously HS2 comes along and there is a lot of concern around the impact that it's going to cause on the environment. So if we look at what we implement, if you click on, we obviously put in the main scheme, and as part of that we're mitigating effects. If we click on again, for that we're trying to compensate and mitigate the loss of ancient woodland or woodlands, also for mitigating effects for visual effects, and trying to integrate the scheme into the landscape, and also trying to reconnect the railway with not just with biodiversity, but also for re-establishing our rights of way. What HS2 are conscious of is obviously that we're working to a no net loss scenario. So what we're trying to think about is how we can use our additional funds that we have to try and go more than that, beyond that, to look at additional benefits. So not quite in terms of a net gain scenario, but how we can do more to be a good neighbour. So what we're looking at is our funding from CEF-BLEF, our panel funds and the woodland funds. So how we can address things like improvements to water courses and water quality, how we might improve our historic environment in terms of parks and gardens or the setting of ancient monuments, looking at the provision of green spaces away from the route which connect up to it, which are beneficial to communities, health and well-being, and also looking at additional woodland planting throughout our woodland fund. So cumulatively, what we're looking at is trying to establish something that's greater than the sum of the parts. So how all these things might connect. So not only are we trying to create bigger, better joined up habitats, but also looking at other benefits. and it's communicating that with our stakeholders. So it's not about HS2 doing these things, it's trying to enable our stakeholders to realise their projects, but looking at the synergies with our own. But it's not confined just to the rural environment, but we also have to think about the urban environment too, which sometimes gets neglected. So if we just click on again, Hugo. Obviously HS2 are making provision for green space around stations, but what can we also do to be a good neighbour around the stations themselves, and also in the communities in our cities, for providing more green space, sort of greening our streets in terms of more trees, and putting in more areas for recreation along our canals, and also creating things like pocket parks. So it's trying to release those funds and trying to be a bit more agile with it. So going back to the mitigation element, because we're looking at these in two parts, is what HS2 is doing is obviously we're trying to look at the Lawton principles about being bigger, better, more joined up in habitats and woodlands. But it's not just about that. We're also thinking around the design itself, and that what we're actually implementing with our contractors is fits in with the character of the landscape, and that we are reconnecting that. It's not just about a numbers game in terms of habitats created, but that we are looking at the context in which we're putting our planting in. And it's obviously about the reconnection as well of those places too. If we move on. And so far, we've planted over 430,000 trees and created 60 new habitats. So that's in terms of HS2, in terms of what we're trying to do. So if we go on in terms to the next slide, what we're trying to do is not just convey HS2's principles and what we're delivering, but also we've created a prospectus to go out to stakeholders that outlines the broad principles of our mitigation and compensation, but also the opportunities that lie for our stakeholders. So what we're interested in terms of our funds is the benefits that can be accrued from the funding that we award to various projects. And so we have this 13 points, or a baker's dozen, of different benefits that we're looking at for each project. So rather than just dole out money to projects that are affected along the route, we're looking at the synergies relating to those projects. Next slide. So a key part of that is not just articulating that is through a mapping tool, and the mapping tool is going to be very key to highlighting two things. Firstly, what we're doing with our mitigation in terms of the location of the mitigation that's going in, so people can see in real time or over time the development of our mitigation. So we have this scenario where we're showing the improvement, if you like, of our mitigation that we're putting in for it. And it's not just about what we've done through the hybrid build, but a scenario where we're showing through our contractors how that design is changing and evolving. So people will be able to interrogate through a series of reports in GIS around what HS2 are putting in. I think one of the things we've had problems over in the past is around communicating information. And through the GIS platform, or this mapping tool, we'll be able to do that. And people will be able to see for themselves where mitigation is going in and what we're taking out crucially. So there'll be statistics on there, so we have this level of transparency. Also, in addition to that, in purple we see on the screen is we're able to show the awards that we've made for these additional projects. And what we're interested in showing is the synergies with these awards against what we're putting in. So we have this sort of joined up spatial pattern of what's creating the green corridor. So there'll be a lot of metadata to go in with this that people will be able to download and look at. But I think for our stakeholders, they'll be able to see where they might have a possible project that could come to fruition with help with those funds. So if we move on the screen there, I think there was one of the projects that was highlighted, and that's Thames 21, where we're making improvements to along the watercourses, which is a community project that prevents bank erosion, increases biodiversity, and makes general improvements to the river. But it's a good project as well in that it involves local communities, and there's a sense of identity and health and well-being for those that participate. We also have another project, so we're able to show the diversity of funds and the magnitude of funding, and probably one of the biggest that we've so far contributed towards is probably Wendover Woods, where we spent 450,000 on a community centre in the centre of Wendover Woods, which is going to benefit the local area in terms of jobs and employment, but also brings opportunities for people visiting the site from areas around Aylesbury. And what we're also trying to also measure is the benefits to the socioeconomics in terms of what that's going to do. Then finally, it's around the legacy that the Green Corridor leaves. Obviously, there's a long lead-in time to this. This is not going to happen overnight, and it's going to be a slow burn in terms of temporarily trying to see our mitigation come to fruition. But what we're trying to address are the tenets of the government's 25-year plan around the nature recovery network and local nature recovery strategies. So we're already doing quite a lot of that with creating and restoring wildlife-rich habitats, increasing woodland cover, and planting more trees in towns and cities. But what we're also trying to think about is looking at other objectives like the National Pollinator Strategy, and also the opportunities that the nascent agricultural bill might bring along as well. But what we're trying to do is put this prospectus and the mapping tool out to the public to try and get them involved in trying to realise this Green Corridor project. So what I'll do now is hand over to Serena, who'll give you some details about specific projects.
Thank you very much, David, for that really interesting oversight, and thank you to HS2 for inviting me along today. My name's Serena, I work for Costain, and I've been lucky enough to work across both the enabling and the main works projects on HS2. So to give you a bit on our scope of works, we start right in Euston in central London, working our way through northwest London, through the Old Oak Common area and out towards Hillingdon and West Ruislip. So we're building over 40 kilometres of tunnels with 8 vent shaft head houses. We're also building TBM launch sites, crossover boxes, portals. So the scope of works just on our section of HS2 is enormous. So moving on to how our sites work with ecology. So on the enabling works contract, we have cleared over 126,000 square metres of vegetation. And throughout this, we've accrued over 1,700 ecology surveys and days of site support. So that survey is looking at everything from newts, badgers, bats, invasive species. We have got a team of full-time ecologists on our project, and they're an invaluable resource. We've also put in place a really effective permit process. So this ensures that any site team needs to have a written and signed permit before any vegetation can be cleared. And this is a very similar process to, say, a permit to dig, a permit to lift, which are very common in the construction industry. And we found this to be a really successful process. We've also done a huge amount of work in terms of upskilling and educating our site teams, more of which I'll touch on later. So I'd like to share with you 3 of our best practices from site, 3 initiatives we've got going. And these are just 3 out of an enormous selection. So the first one is using drones, cameras and time-lapse videos to identify potential nesting birds. So the example here, obviously left-hand side photo is one of our drones. The right-hand side is a building that we were demolishing. And this is actually a section of the roof void. We had our concerns that a nesting bird could be present there. Obviously, the law states that any nesting bird must be protected. We employed a drone with a very powerful camera, so this meant it could stay far enough away from the potential nest, while also zooming in far enough to give us the footage we needed. So we could identify those sensitive features at the same time avoiding any potential disturbance. We were then able to analyse the footage with the site teams, team of ecologists, and everyone could have a look and we could say, yes, there is a nesting bird, or no, no bird, we're safe to carry on with works. This technique also removed the need for working at heights. We didn't need any cherry pickers on site, so this had massive health and safety advantages. It was also a cheap option, so our commercial team were very happy, and that's a welcome bonus. And it also ensured that we had a really reliable set of ecology data because we had that footage. And that can be kept for a long time, it can be referred back to, and it can also be shared with other site teams. So we feel this is an example of us really pushing, being really innovative with how we embrace technology and ecology. So moving on to our second best practice. I think this is a really fantastic good news story. So Regent's Park in London is the only London park to have a breeding population of hedgehogs. We are installing a lorry holding area very close to the park, which will enable lorry access to some of our more central London and Euston sites. So we knew we needed to provide a way for the hedgehogs to move around in a safe and protected way. So we worked with both London Zoo and the Royal Parks to design a mammal tunnel, which allows for the safe passage of hedgehogs and allows them to move around their separate habitats. We not only built this tunnel, but we've also provided our site teams with hedgehog training. So that means that if a hedgehog does wander onto site during our works, all the site teams know exactly what to do, how to safely remove the hedgehog from the area and protect it from any harm. So yeah, our third and final one. So slowworms obviously are a protected native species. So as part of the enabling works, we were working in the Old Oak Common area, which is in West London and will be the site of one of the future HS2 stations. So we were carrying out some vegetation clearance, just kind of to the side of the Old Oak Common site, right where that red arrow is pointing. This was a known area of a slowworm population, especially due to the fact there were some unused railways there, which are a very popular habitat for reptiles, including slowworms. So we knew there were slowworms there. We knew we had to clear the area. So from day one of those works being planned, we engaged our ecology team, got them involved and helped them plan the works. We carried out fingertip searches every day and removed by hand any potential slowworms, as you can see in those two photos, and put them in an area of safety away from where we were working. So this showed that it was a really effective process. We translocated over 30 slowworms and protected that population. From getting the buy-in from the site team, those planning the works, the operatives and the ecologists from day one, we were able to make a really big difference and carry out the works really successfully. We had an ecological clerk of works in-house and on-site. They were very much part of the site team and very much a really good source of knowledge. So we were able to create a real culture of looking after ecology on that site. All the site teams knew who the ecologists were, knew that they were the people to speak to, and knew that they absolutely had the power to say yay or nay to a piece of works going ahead. So it was a really good culture of respecting the ecologists, respecting their decisions. And also by having our ecologist in-house on site, we massively de-risked these works. So the risk of having to stop works completely, off-hire machinery, stand down a whole team was removed because we had that ecologist there day in, day out, monitoring the works. But this also gave us the opportunity to really upskill our workforce We carried out toolbox talks, briefings, educated them on the wide number of native reptiles we have here in the UK, and I really believe we created a really positive culture towards ecology on our site. So a bit about how we're improving ecology on our project. So far we have built 15 bat boxes, both in the Copthall area and in Euston, so very central urban London sites. We've produced 6 barn owl boxes. We've got really strong evidence of those boxes already being used, which is really positive. We've enhanced newt ponds to support a breeding population. And obviously, as has been mentioned before, HS2 has got a really strong policy of no net biodiversity loss, something that's really pushing us to think about how we track any vegetation clearance, we track any trees that are removed, we create a really good log and a really powerful data set. So when it comes to replacing and improving local biodiversity, we've got that knowledge to hand. So I think it's worth saying that I am part of a huge environment team here at SCS in the southern parts of HS2. We've also got a huge number of specialists in our team, and we are out there day in, day out, making recommendations, providing advice, stepping in when needed, and really ensuring that this project has the smallest possible impact on the local environment. So I'd like to say thank you to HS2 for inviting me along today, and I'd love to pass it over to Joe, who is our next speaker.
Thank you, Serena, and thank you to HS2 for this opportunity today. It's a good chance for us to showcase what we've been doing on the scheme and try and promote some of the good work that the project is doing. My name is Joe Bradshaw. I'm the Habitats Manager at Keystone Environmental, and between our contracting and our consultancy division, we've been creating some of these mitigation sites that have been mentioned so far, and also translocating some species into them. This first slide that we have here is the first mitigation site that we built for LMJV on behalf of HS2. This is at Finland Brook, and today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit more about the challenges that we've faced and the establishment of these sites, and then what the next step is once they've been created in terms of actually stocking them with flora and fauna. So for us, initially it's very hard to envisage what these sites are going to look like. We have these plans that we are provided. This is what we work to, and what it's really about is moving from the conception phase to the creation phase and trying to help HS2 produce this legacy, which will be the Green Corridor. So each site has a very specific design. It may well be for a specific species. In this instance, the one we have on screen, Finland Brook, was a mitigation site for great crested newts, where we would be creating new ponds and basking banks, high vernacular, which is somewhere for newts to forage and also to take refuge through the winter months. But each site is bespoke in that it has target species that it's looking to compensate for, and that is all part of the design process that becomes part of our responsibility to go and implement. So at Finland Brook in particular, we planted 6,000 new trees. We put in over 1,000 marginal and aquatic plants. We did a considerable amount of wildflower seeding. The key habitat features there really are the 4 new ponds, which will house newts that are being taken from 2 existing ponds. So for the 2 ponds which have been lost, 4 ponds have been created on this particular site. We've also installed a 35-metre long basking bank, again, which serves the same sort of purpose as the high vernacular, and installed stock fencing and various other features which have kind of been added value in creating the site. So what I wanted to try and demonstrate today is what we start with, and then how quickly that transitions into a functional haven for wildlife. So this is Finland Brook when we first arrived. Unfortunately, I don't have any panoramic photos, but essentially it was a very barren field. It was very heavily grazed, it was species poor. There wasn't really a lot there, although it did have good connectivity to off-site habitat. You know, it's in the name that there's a brook running through the southern part of the site. There's some woodland adjoining it, and also some very good hedgerow networks. So for us, it was really about then integrating these, which is what the Green Corridor is really all about. So you can see there, the site, it looks a lot worse before it looks better. We had a very extensive cut and fill exercise to do because of the topography of the land. We had some extremely challenging weather conditions, but if we move on to the next slide, you'll see that very quickly what can look like a very barren environment comes to life. These photos are all taken within 2 years of the site being completed. You can see very clearly there how well the wildflower seeding is taken in the areas of disturbed ground. The patch in the centre of the field, on the top right image, is an area of land that we didn't touch. So it gives you an idea of you know, the contrast between what was there and the enhancements that have been done surrounding it. But in time, this site will be managed so that biodiversity is optimised across the whole site. We've got a very similar site, which is just across the road, and I wanted to touch on this one. Although the works were very similar, it demonstrates the Green Corridor in that these mitigation sites that are the habitat creation that are happening in the early phases are particularly focused on species mitigation, and they will form stepping stones, which in time will be linked by the Green Corridor. So again, we planted a few thousand new trees, created some ponds, and built some hibernacular and put in a vast amount of new stock fencing. And again, you'll see that the site during the construction phase, it could look a bit desolate at first. We've got some images there of what it was like before. You can actually see some Newt fencing there in the images. We had to do a translocation exercise on this particular field. The findings were fairly minimal, so the newts were relocated to their source pond whilst we create a mitigation site, and then the area of land was opened up. So again, as with most of the sites that we as a company have created, the pond there is being lined with puddling clay that goes down to a depth of 300 millimeters to ensure long-term viability of these water bodies. Then again, within a couple of years, I think most of these images that will appear on the next slide are about a year after the pond was created, the site was created. And we've had a very different sward and series of plants that have come up on this particular site, and it just goes to show that the soil conditions can give quite varying sites, even though the same seed mix was put down. And this site in particular has been a haven for butterflies and dragonflies. We've got a broad-bodied chaser there and an emperor dragonfly. As I say, these images were taken a year after the site was created, and I think the key point I'm trying to get across is that it doesn't take long for wildlife to move in effectively. In the context of these two sites, we've had great crested newts relocated to them, and they have bred in the ponds on the first year after being translocated to the site, which is a great story for us. It shows that they're happy in their new habitat, and over time that population will be monitored to make sure that favourable conservation status is maintained. So moving on from Finland Brook 073, again, just some before and after images. These are all taken within a year of each other, and you can see how quickly the environment can change. A lot of the discussions that we have with people about HS2 is their concern about the aesthetic impact if they aren't particularly benefited by the scheme. But again, linking in with what Graham was saying at the beginning, that the Green Corridor will be for people and for wildlife. It will be a space that people can enjoy on their doorstep, and it's a stark contrast from what is there currently. Every mitigation site that we as a company have created has been in effectively very barren habitat. We're talking stubble fields or heavily grazed pasture, and within a year they've turned into wildlife havens. We've got lots of new species which are moving into these sites of their own accord. This particular site here in these slides is near Saltham, near Dallas Burston Polo Club, and great crested newts moved into this site. They bred in the ponds within the first 6 months of being created, which was fantastic for us. They weren't relocated to the site, they colonised of their own accord. We have a fantastic population of grass snakes which now are utilising the site. And each of these individual sites with their bespoke design also have a bespoke management plan, in that the species will be monitored, the habitats will be monitored, and if there are any remedial works that need to take place, or if the population isn't doing as well as what we'd anticipate, then action will be taken. And I think that shows HS2's commitment to, it's not a case of creating these sites and stepping away. They will be managed now moving forward to make sure that they remain as optimal habitat. So what I wanted to touch on here also was some of our goals to link in with HS2's key drivers of creating these sites and utilising what is there, as well as trying to meet the design. So some of these images, the lower two in particular, this is a site that was on an area of wasteland outside a farm. It wasn't particularly used because of the drainage on it, and so we were able to use a lot of materials there to create something beneficial to wildlife. This basking bank at the bottom here, everything that you can see in that image and more was sourced from site, with the local, liaising with the local stakeholders to create a feature which will be utilised by wildlife. The pond that you can see in the top left, again, we've got an image of it a year later, and this site soon will be receiving reptiles from another part of the scheme, which is what I'll move on to shortly. In terms of these sites, before anything is relocated to them, they go through a very stringent process of ensuring that they are ready to receive, be it newts or reptiles, and that's through a very detailed process of checking the establishment of the ponds, the water quality, making sure that there's sufficient egg laying material for the newts in the ponds, making sure that the grassland sward is nice and dense and there's a lot of invertebrates in there if reptiles are going to be, such as slow worms, are going to be moved into the site. So I think the key message is, if the sites aren't ready, then the work doesn't proceed. So it's really the wildlife is coming first, and I think that's really something that HS2 have had a key drive on. So I'll finish with summarising in terms of our habitat creation works on the scale of what we've been doing. We've created 17 ponds, we've planted over 30,000 trees, over 100,000 metres squared of grassland and wildflower seeding, 17 hibernacula, 9 basking banks, and we are really just a drop in the ocean of what's been going on. It seems like we've achieved so much. We're very proud of what our sites are now looking like, and the reception they're getting, and in particular how well the wildlife is doing within them. But as I say, these are small stepping stones. 60 sites have been created, 430,000 trees, and there's another 6.5 million more which will help to make up the green corridor. So the next phase for us as a company is populating these sites. Most of the ones that we have created have been specifically for great crested newts, and the way that we go about translocating those is we put in fencing there. This fencing is interspersed with pitfall traps and carpet tiles, and effectively it breaks up the habitat, and when the newts are transitioning through that habitat, they hit the fencing, they turn left and right, and they drop into the pitfall traps, or they take refuge under the carpet tiles. It's a very simple process, it's very effective. I think it's been demonstrated well by the destructive searches which have to happen. I use the word destructive search. It really is as sensitive as it can be, and it shows that very few residual newts and amphibians are left on these sites after the translocation process has taken place. So all of this fencing, it has to go in under license. You can see here these individual numbers on the left-hand side are amphibian metapopulations. We've worked on 20 or so sites so far. We've put in 60 kilometres of Newt fencing, all under license, and each site has its own site-specific method statement, which tells us where the fencing needs to go. It's focused in terms of survey information which has fed into it, and also with the long-term design to make sure that all of the areas are cleared of newts which are going to be required by main works. 60,000 metres, that's the same length as the M42, and this is just on the northern section of the route. There are other contractors putting in fencing as well, so it really is a massive undertaking. To expand on that a little bit, this is the first site that we translocated. The data that we capture on HS2 is unlike any other scheme we've worked on. And we map every newt, the location where it's caught, when it's caught, the temperatures, and rainfall, which is standard practice anyway. But it really gives us a good understanding of where the newts are utilising their habitat, what their movements are at different times of year, when the peak movements are in terms of overnight temperatures and rainfall, and where to focus our efforts when we've finished checking the traps. We then work our way through the terrestrial habitat. We're turning over logs, we're looking through leaf piles to make sure that we really are mopping up as many of these individual amphibians as we can. The next slide demonstrates quite effectively, I think, the early stages of the translocation. We've got the captures and the rainfall here, as well as temperatures, but you can clearly see when there's a peak in rainfall, then we get a spike in amphibian captures the next day. And then as the translocation progresses, this was actually a 60-day translocation. We stopped catching newts after day 58, I believe, but you can see that the correlation between captures and rainfall is very matched early in the translocation, and then later as the population, the residual population, starts to fall, we're getting the rainfall, but we're not getting the captures. And then that's the key thing, is that these sites are not deemed clear until we are confident that sufficient survey effort or translocation effort has taken place. We must have 5 clear days where we don't catch a great crested newt, and following that, and those 5 days must be during suitable weather conditions, and then the site is effectively declared clear of newts, and the destructive search will come in, as I say, to do targeted search of any key habitat features. And our translocation data really helps us see where those newts might still be on these particular sites. As well as the fencing and pitfall trap translocation, we've got aquatic trapping that we do here. So this can be if a pond is being lost, bottle trapping will take place. We've got some great crested newts here which we've caught. And further to this, there may also be some netting exercises. We've done torching surveys where you are literally walking the fence lines at night in the dark when the newts are moving, and just trying to make sure that we really do get as many of these amphibians as we can. The thing that I'd really like, and I think does sometimes get missed, is the umbrella effect. You know, people will see that it's a lot of effort and time that's going into these great crested newt translocations, but it's also mopping up an awful lot of other species in the process. And I think in terms of the mitigation sites that we've created, the umbrella effect for other wildlife is huge. Invertebrates in particular, which are the building blocks really of biodiversity. But here we've demonstrated on this slide the numbers that we have moved is 2,000 great crested newts, 8,500 toads, and these figures are actually dated now. This was about a week ago, and we've had a real rush with this wet spell. But all of these amphibians have been moved to these new habitats, and one of the things that we have noticed is that a lot of the ponds that we are clearing are in these barren farmland environments, which aren't optimal foraging habitat, and the population size really is hindered by the availability of this good quality habitat immediately around the ponds, and that is what is being created now. We've got ponds in prime grassland with plenty of areas to refuge, so there's absolutely no reason why these populations shouldn't be relocated to these new sites and thrive once they get there. And as I say, the management plans and the monitoring surveys will ensure that they do so. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Joe, and to all the speakers. So in the 15 minutes we've got remaining, I'm going to ask some of the questions that you guys have been sending in. Thank you very much for all of them. There's a lot, so I don't think we'll be going to get through all of them, I'm afraid, but we will do our best to get through as many as we can. So the first question says, this is an exciting project and a fabulous opportunity to raise the bar and set standards in environmental and sustainability. Some of the HS2 documents I've seen show great initiative. Will biodegradable lubricants and fuels be stipulated by HS2 in the civil engineering phase and within contracts awarded? So, Serena, I believe this is something that you guys are already using, is that right?
Yes, so as Tier 1 contractor, something we're widely using across our sites. So not only does the Code of Construction practice require us to use biodegradable fuels and lubricants, it's also a key part of lots of our water consents. So on our sites, we're working near canals or water sources. We're also required by those local consenting bodies to use biodegradable fuels and lubricants. So yeah, definitely something we're fully embracing.
That's great. Next question, I think this is one for you, David, which is, has the green corridor been mapped on the basis of biodiversity and the connectivity of species habitats along migratory paths required for adaptation to climate change? If you could just come off mute, David.
So in response to
David, you're on mute. If you could just take yourself off that.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so we've responded to that in terms of the information that's come out of our ecological surveys, and we've designed our mitigation accordingly to that. So I can think of a number of cases on phase 1 around Burnwood, where we look at migration across the route, so we're aware of the severance that the route causes, and we've tried to address that with green bridges and under bridges in terms of the migration. So yeah, it's very much in response to that, and our mitigation sort of reflects that too. I hope that answers the question.
Brilliant. And we've got another question for you here, Dave, if you just keep your mic on. Is there an aspiration to link existing green pockets in urban environments?
Again, it's the same principle.
Again, you seem to have gone on mute again, David. I apologise. Sorry, David, you seem to have gone on mute again. So if you could take yourself off mute. There you go. We seem to have lost David's mic, so I'm going to go to another question, if that's okay. This is to Joe, by the looks of it. The question is, will all your sites have such a quick turnaround? Just a year or two isn't very long to transform them.
No, certainly not. It's very much species dependent, and also on how well they establish. So each habitat type in terms of woodland or grassland and the ponds has a set bedding in period, which is stipulated by HS2. So it really is careful program management to make sure that the sites are created well in advance of when that land is required. But further to that, if there has been any particular reason why the site hasn't established as well as it should or as quickly, the maturation reports that are done on that site kind of conclude that, and then implement any additional works. We had the drought in 2018, which was terrible. We fared fairly well on our sites with less than 10% failure, but I know that restocking was done. There was also some additional aquatic planting. One of the sites that you saw on screen was Curdworth, and that's going to be used for reptile translocation, but that's got a 2-year bedding in period to allow the grassland to establish there into a dense sward and make sure that it's got the invertebrate life there to support the reptiles which will be moved into it. So it's very much a case-by-case basis. Realise a year isn't a particularly long time, but most of these sites, they're created in 2-3 months, and then they really aren't moved into until they're ready to receive animals.
Brill, thanks very much, Joe. Serena, looks like we've got another one for you here, which is most of your work seems to take place in London. Is it difficult undertaking ecology work in such a big city?
So yeah, we've got lots of sites all throughout both central London and on the outskirts. I wouldn't say it's any more or less than undertaking ecology work, say in more traditional countryside areas. I think the biggest thing that we found is people are very surprised at how much ecology there is in central London. We've put bat boxes right next to Euston Station, and people were very surprised that there was actually a population of bats there. So yeah, there's far more ecology in central London than people realise.
It's good to hear. I've got another one actually about hedgehog tunnels, asking whether those hedgehog tunnels you showed are in use now and have been successful.
Yes, so I think they are in use. We did a lot of work with the royal parks, looking at the entrances and what materials we use to make them really attractive. So yes, those hedgehog tunnels are up and running, which is a fantastic news story for the project.
That's really good to hear. Thanks, Serena. David, we're going to give your mic another go if that's okay, because we've got a question here saying, are there any similar plans to create a green corridor along phase 2A? Which of course we are expecting royal assent for, hopefully by the end of the year. Just waiting for David to take himself off mute there. Although we might seem to have lost him, unfortunately. However, we do have one question here, which I don't know if you, Serena, or Joe would like to take while we try and get David back, which is, have there been other projects you've modelled your approach on, and how does that compare what you're doing today on HS2? Probably more a question for David, but if you guys could explain a little bit about any projects you've worked on in the past and anything you've learned from that you've put across to HS2, I think that would be quite valuable. So that's an open question to either Joe or Serena.
I can give a very brief answer to that. Joe's probably got far more experience than I have. So previously worked on projects like Crossrail, which might not seem like a lot of ecology, but also, yeah, there was a lot of ecology works there. I think one of the big learnings we've taken over to HS2 is to have our ecologists as part of the team and in-house. So you've got that resource there straight from day one. And also our permitting procedure, that's been a big one. Construction teams are very used to a permit to lift, a permit to carry out hot works, a permit to remove any vegetation has also proved really successful. Costain itself has also taken a lot of learnings from other highway projects. So yeah, definitely used lots of lessons learned and brought them onto HS2.
Yeah, if I may, Hugo, I think one of the big things for us has been the adaptability of HS2 and the change in mindset. I've been working in consultancy for 15 years, and ecology has always been an inconvenience, or it's just something that they have to do, rather than the more proactive approach that HS2 are taking. This is wide-scale landscape mitigation. It's not insular mitigation, and like we see on a lot of construction projects, where you create a little pocket of habitat which is completely isolated, and also the adaptability. If we are out on these sites every day, we are learning about the sites as we manage them, and then we are taking steps and presenting that information to HS2 to inform future management. We've got sites where you'll do weed management, but then you might have a pocket of a certain species which is utilised by a particular butterfly or moth, and then we will justify the case between leaving. So we are maximising leaving that particular bit of habitat, so that we are maximising the species that these sites can be utilised by. I think a question came in about natural regeneration. We've had some sites where we've got there, and in truth, the baseline surveys were a little bit dated, and there's already woodland starting to establish naturally, and we've relayed that back to HS2, and subsequently that area has been left to develop of its own accord.
Great, thanks, Joe, and thanks very much, Serena. We've got time for one last question. We do like to try and finish our meetings at HS2 before the hour, given everyone's got back-to-back video meetings these days. So we're going to try again for David and see if his microphone is working. So David, the question we've pitched to you before is, are there any similar plans to create a green corridor running along phase 2A of the railway? Well, we tried, and it was a nice idea, but we seem to have lost David, so we will leave it there. Thanks very much to all the presenters for dialing in, and thank you very much everybody for attending this webinar. I hope you found it useful. We will be publishing the slides afterwards should you want to see them, and a recording of it on our YouTube channel. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and thank you very much for dialing in.